He's an epic figure in human history, and he's used by God with his nation Babylon to judge the nation of Judah and to take them off into captivity in the 6th century BC. And so what we're going to do now is finish up all of the history books of the Old Testament. The three we have remaining, because we've already gone through 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, is we have Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Now these three books are called the exilic books. It's another period of time, another period of history in the nation of Israel. It's the period of the exile, which simply means that they've been carted off into captivity and now they're in exile as a nation. And so it deals specifically with the southern kingdom because, as I said before, the northern kingdom is kind of dispersed off into the nations and is lost. And so as the world powers begin to change and shift focus here, Assyria is overcome by Babylon, Babylon is overcome by Persia, Persia is overcome by Greece, Greece is overcome by Rome, and we see human history kind of shaped before our very eyes. We can still see God working within the context of human history, his plan of redemption continuing to progress through human history. And we have these particular books that are written, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, that record for us the period of time in which God's people were in captivity. That's why they're called the books of exile. And so of these books, they're really books that focus on the remnant and the restoration. Ezra is a scribe, and Ezra is a man that God uses to bring a return of the people of Israel, the Jews, back to the nation of Israel. And his focus in the return between him and another character named Zerubbabel, and the two times in which they bring people back to Israel, is to rebuild the temple, rebuild the worship system, because they understand that the reason they've been carted off into captivity, the reason God has judged them, and the reason God's favor has left them is because they have disobeyed God and turned their hearts away from him. So the focus of Ezra is to turn the hearts of the people back to God, to reestablish worship as the core foundational thing for them as a nation. And so that's kind of what's happening here as they begin to return and reestablish themselves. And so these remnants begin to return. And remnant is a term that we begin to hear throughout this period of the Old Testament, and even dating back even further, about God communicating this idea of a remnant. That even though God's judgment was going to fall, that he was going to preserve for himself a remnant, or a small portion or a segment of the people that he would preserve and then would bring back to restore. And so the people that are returning with Ezra and Zerubbabel and then Nehemiah, they're really God's remnant of people that he's going to use to rebuild. And we can kind of see that theme has been patterned for us throughout Old Testament, that even in periods of time where God's hand of judgment was upon the earth and upon his people, that God was always preserving a remnant. And that's because he always has a plan. God uses a man, a person, or a woman, and God has a plan. And so that's kind of how he operates within human history. So the first return was under Zerubbabel. That was about 50,000 exiles and a bunch of leaders that came back to the land of Palestine. And like I said before, the focus for them was worship. Zerubbabel wanted them to come back and for them to re-engage and lay the foundation of the remnant returning and restoring the nation after this period of exile, restoring them to a heart of worship. Now we find that as they begin to restore worship, they begin to restore the walls as Nehemiah rebuilt those, that the surrounding territory and the peoples that are surrounding this area, they don't like what's happening. They don't want Israel to be rebuilt. They don't want Jerusalem to be refortified. They don't want Israel to come back. And so there's going to be, in the context of these exilic books, a lot of stories of confrontation between the people of Israel returning, the remnant returning from exile, and those that are around them, the surrounding nations, really coming into conflict with them and trying to prevent them from restoring things. We see that they're motivated by prophets and all of those things. And over the course of nearly about 80 years, over 1,500 Jews are led back out of Babylon to Israel. Because remember, they're only returning from the southern kingdom, these two tribes in Babylon. And so some great stories there about Ezra restoring revival, Ezra restoring worship. And this is all kind of that post-exilic period, or the time after the exile, which is around post-597 BC. So I would say probably around 605 BC is when we have that, when Darius allows Jews to return back to Israel. What's really cool about this period of time here too is much like Ruth, during this period of time, there's this picture, this glimpse of a story, and the story is of Esther. And Esther's great theme is providence, God's hand moving over the course of human history. And so I'm really excited to share with you some of the themes and things about the book of Esther, because just like Ruth, during a period of time, it overlays this period and gives us a glimpse into the culture, gives us a glimpse into behind the scenes, what God is doing with the people. And so go with me and turn, if you would, to the book of Esther. So if you're at the book of Esther there, I want to read to you one verse that really kind of sums up the entire idea and theme of Esther, this concept of providence, or God's sovereign hand upon events of human history. In chapter 4 of Esther and verse, let's go to verse 14. This is Mordecai, Esther's uncle, talking to her and really encouraging her to step out. You probably know this story pretty well. You know, we have an attempt by a character named Haman to destroy all of the Jews. You know, we mentioned way back in one of the first sessions that there's only 4 chapters in the entire Bible where God's enemy and the adversary of God's people, Satan, is not around. And those are the first 2 chapters of Genesis and the last 2 chapters of Revelation. But the entire time in between, even the time that we find ourselves in now, we see that our adversary is out to destroy. He's out to kill, steal, and destroy, as it says in John. And so here we see another attempt of the enemy to destroy God's people, to thwart God's plan and purpose to bring the Messiah. If Satan can destroy the Jews, then he knows that he can destroy God's plan, because the Messiah is going to come from the Jewish people, right? So here Haman is this character that's used to lead an attempt to destroy the Jewish people. Here's what's really fascinating too, is that you can actually trace Haman's ancestry all the way back to Esau. Remember Esau, the man whose heart was not after God, he was the brother of Jacob and didn't desire those things that were spiritual. Really, in actuality, if you look at the genealogy of Haman, it'll take you all the way back to the Edomites, who Esau was the father of. Pretty interesting. So we see in this context here Mordecai coming to Esther and saying, hey, I need to encourage you here about what your mission is, what your purpose is, and how God may use you. So verse 14 of chapter 4 says, for if you remain silent, Mordecai talking to Esther, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And listen to this, and who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. You know, that's really the theme of Esther, is the idea that God is using people in His divine providence to accomplish His purpose. And we may not understand where we're at. We may not understand what God is doing. We may not understand or even see how God has positioned us. But who knows what we don't see, and who can understand what God is doing? And we need to be able to trust that, you know what? God is sovereign, and God may have just put you in the place that you're at, may have just positioned you in such a way for such a time that is about to be, or such a time as this in your life, that God is going to use you in a dynamic way, that God can move through you if you'll just submit yourself to His will. And we find that Esther really does that. Esther says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and risk everything. Because at the time, we have this story probably taking place, theologians would guess, between chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra, taking place during the time of the Persian Empire. And we find that for someone to enter into the king's court without being invited was a penalty of death over that. And so we see that when Esther approached the king, even though she was queen, we see that she was really taking her own life into her own hands and placing her trust in God that everything would work out. So we really see the beauty of that taking place here. And as you read through that story, we just see God's divine hand preserving the nation of Israel. As a matter of fact, there's a feast, it's called the Feast of Purim, that the nation still celebrates to this day. And the Feast of Purim was instituted because of God's deliverance of the people in the story of Esther at this time. And so that's what they're celebrating during the Feast of Purim. They're celebrating God preserving the nation of Israel as he did through history here. Esther being a great, beautiful book of providence. The story being a great story. It's just a fun story to read, a fun story to see. You know, and at the end, the bad guy really gets what he deserves. He built these gallows to hang all the Jews, and then that ends up getting flipped around, and he ends up getting hanged on the very gallows that the Jews are going to be hanged on, that his whole evil plot was supposed to be. And it's just Mordecai who's humbled and beaten down, gets elevated, and it's just this incredible story of fate's changing place, and we see God's hand moving. You know, God truly is sovereign, and God's hand is truly is over the earth and all the things that are going on. And God does give authority and place even our leaders, who may not even know God personally. He is in control. He places authority, places them in positions of authority, and even gives them their authority. What did Jesus say to Pontius Pilate when he was questioning him? And Jesus mentioned to him, well, the only reason you have authority is because you've received it from above, that God has given you authority. And so God is in control. We see his providence. We see his sovereignty. We see him in control in stories like these in Esther. And we know as we look back over the history of Israel and we see just the ups and downs and the different things that are going on, we can now look back and see God moving, that this undercurrent of the Lord God is moving, and that the primary mission is that God's plan is moving forward. It's easy for us to look at life and to get overwhelmed with what's happening on the surface and forget that we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but that we are spiritual, and there's spiritual forces that we are engaging in battle with, and that victory has already been given us, that really the end has already been written, that we are victorious in Jesus' name. And so I love these stories. I love the story of Nehemiah, how God calls Nehemiah out of a place of privilege, and Nehemiah responds to his call and goes in. And the book of Nehemiah is such an incredible book of great leadership, where Nehemiah goes in to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. We see some incredible things there, and so let's look at that just briefly as we begin to close this session out here. So turn with me, if you will, to the book of Nehemiah. Okay, so in the book of Nehemiah, it really opens with, these times of returning. Israel's returning to the nation of Israel, and it's a great period of distress because they had originally returned, and restored the worship center there, but the nations surrounding were really beginning to get antagonistic towards them, and so they really needed to build some defenses. And so just like God works, God's got a plan, and he looks around to find if there's a person who will respond to his call. And we find that Nehemiah is that man in this period of time in the context of our story here. And God's call falls on Nehemiah, and he leaves his place of privilege and decides that he's going to lead a group back to Jerusalem, and his purpose is going to be to rebuild the defenses of the city. Nehemiah is an incredible book on leadership. You can read through that and just see the example of Nehemiah to us on how to be an excellent leader, even in the face, and especially in the face of great adversity. The problem that Nehemiah faced when he got back to Jerusalem is that all the walls of the city had been destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar had come to put the nation of Israel in subjugation in his empire. His empire expanded during this period of time in the 6th century. He had overcome the Assyrians, and he was actually going to march down to Egypt to take Egypt as part of his kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar was probably one of the greatest world leaders that we've ever seen. When you look in the book of Daniel, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that Daniel interprets for him. I believe it's in Daniel chapter 2. And Nebuchadnezzar dreams of this statue that has different layers of metal. The head of the statue is gold. The chest and the upper arms, the arm areas, those are silver. The abdomen and the upper part of the legs, the thighs, are bronze. Then the legs are iron. And then the feet are iron mixed with clay. This is the dream that God gives King Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king during this beginning of this exilic period here. And the king really represents the succession of empires on world history. It's a prophetic picture into what God was going to do. And God gives Daniel the interpretation of this dream. The interpretation, quite simply, is the head of gold is King Nebuchadnezzar. It's the Babylonian Empire. And so Nebuchadnezzar is this mighty one single world ruler that basically solidifies this empire over the entire known world. What's interesting is right before he gets to Egypt, he at the city of Carchemish, he defeats the Egyptian army, and he begins to march down to Egypt to take control. And on his way, he subjugates all these smaller nations, Israel being one of them. And before he gets into Egypt, his dad dies, and he's called back to Babylon to rule as king, from general to king there. And so what happens is in the context of this world history, the Israel kings, the Judah kings, the southern kingdom kings in Jerusalem, they continue to turn away from King Nebuchadnezzar. They'll stop sending tribute back to Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar was satisfied to let them be, to let them rule and reign, as long as they paid tribute to him and they stayed under his authority. But they would continue to rebel, continue to rebel. And so eventually in 597 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar rolls into the city of Jerusalem, sets siege to it. This is the period of time in which Jeremiah is prophet and destroys the entire city. So Nehemiah is returning to Jerusalem, and he finds the city in complete destruction. Nebuchadnezzar's destruction was so complete that practically every single piece of rubble was laid low. The entire walls were razed. Nothing was left. People were living in poverty. And so Ezra and Zerubbabel had already returned. They had restored the center of worship for the people. Their hearts were turned back to God. That's kind of the environment in which Nehemiah was going to work, which was a good thing. He needed the people to be unified. But Nehemiah comes back, and his responsibility now is to rebuild the defenses of the city, the walls around Jerusalem. So his great counterpart is Sanballat, kind of a rotten guy that's trying to trick Nehemiah into delaying and trying to rally the enemies of Israel in opposition to the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And the way in which Nehemiah really overcomes all of these challenges is that he really becomes a man of deep prayer. Now, it wasn't as a result of the trial that Nehemiah becomes a man of prayer. We see even at the beginning of the story here, in the beginning of Nehemiah, the first chapter is a prayer chapter. It's a chapter of Nehemiah's prayer, and as a result of that, out of that, Nehemiah's call is given to him. We see throughout the Old Testament that oftentimes, and I mentioned Daniel, and so I'll mention that again, even in Daniel chapter 9, we see that Daniel is in deep prayer, and God gives him this incredible revelation, this incredible 70 weeks prophecy that's kind of founded and based upon and patterned after Daniel's prayer. Prayer is such an incredible, deep, important component of a person who's following after God. And we see that a person's calling, especially in the context of Nehemiah, Daniel, or a revelation comes when a person of God is devoted and committed to a life of prayer. So we see that Nehemiah was a deep man of prayer, and when he learned the weakened condition of Jerusalem, he responded to God's calling over him. And then also we see that Nehemiah was a man of courage. He was brave enough to believe that God is who God says he is, and that God's going to do what God said he's going to do. I'll never forget, for me, the day that my whole life changed, and I had a revelation that, you know what, God really is real. It was the day that everything flipped for me. I rededicated my life to God, and it was in that revelation of, wow, God is real. And my belief in that, and a deep conviction that, okay, if God is real, then that means what he says he's going to do, he's going to do. That means that his word is significant. That means that I can trust that he's over things. And so we as people need to, especially in the context of beginning with prayer and beginning with worship and beginning with devoting ourselves to understanding who God is, come to a revelation that God is real. And it's within that revelation that we can find the courage to go forth and do what God has called us to do. And we really see those things playing out in a very, very real sense in the person of Nehemiah. And it's within the context of those things that we find that Nehemiah is a great man of faith, a great man of faith. It's this courage, this prayer life, this faith that enables them to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in an unbelievable amount of time. As a matter of fact, it just takes 52 days for them to rebuild the walls of the entire city of Jerusalem. And here's an incredible leadership principle or leadership lesson that we find from Nehemiah. When Nehemiah comes in, he sees that the walls have to be rebuilt and he's got to do it in a quick time. He doesn't just dispatch everybody to build the walls. He realizes that, hey, if we're just going to go out and slap some mud together and build a wall, the wall's not going to be very strong and it will not be able to withstand an attack of the enemy. But what God enables Nehemiah to see and do through wisdom and leadership here is Nehemiah actually charges each individual Israelite with the responsibility to rebuild the wall that's closest to their home. Now imagine that if you're the leader of your family and you're rebuilding a wall and it's the wall that's right by your home. Guess what? You're going to build that thing stronger than anybody else. Like if they could get through over here and over there, but they're not getting through this part of the wall because I live here. What a great, powerful thing. What great wisdom. And so the walls are rebuilt in just 52 days. The walls are as strong as they need to be to repel attacks. And so now, as the history of Israel closes, we have a remnant returning to Jerusalem after captivity. We have the worship of Israel restored, and we have the walls of Jerusalem rebuilt. And once again, as we look forward now to what God is going to do, we have a whole nation once again restored as God promised He would through the prophets. So in the next sections, or the next two sessions as we close out Old Testament survey here, we're going to look at the other books in the Old Testament, the poetic books, the wisdom books, and the prophetic books. And then we're going to piece all that together, and I'm looking forward to spending that time with you as well. So God bless you, and we'll see you in the next session.